The end of my marriage didn't begin with a fight. It didn't start with slammed doors or angry words hurled across a dinner table. It began with a sunset. One of those impossible, breathtaking sunsets that painters spend their whole lives trying to capture. It began on my honeymoon, with my feet in the whitest sand I had ever seen, and a man by my side who had just promised me forever. And in that perfect moment, with the whole world bathed in gold and rose, I felt a deep, profound, and terrifying chill. A voice, quiet and clear as a bell, whispered from a place inside me I didn't even know existed, and it said, "This is a mistake." This is the story of that voice, the story of how I spent the next decade trying to silence it, how I built a beautiful life on a fractured foundation, and how I finally found the courage to listen when the silence became more deafening than the screaming ever could have been. It's a story about dismantling a dream to find a reality, and realizing that the greatest journey home is the one you take back to yourself. We were in the Maldives. It was the kind of place you see on screensavers, the kind of place that feels less like a real destination and more like a collective fantasy. The water was a shade of turquoise, so vivid it hurt your eyes. Our bungalow sat on stilts over that water, and every morning, I woke up believing I had stepped into someone else's life. The wedding had been a whirlwind of white lace and champagne, of smiling for cameras and hugging relatives I barely knew. It was everything I was told it should be. The honeymoon was supposed to be the exhale. The moment the performance ended and real life, our real life, began. But the performance, I was learning, was just getting started. On the third day, we were walking along the beach as the sun began its descent. He stopped and pulled out his phone. "Let's get a picture," he said, his arm wrapping around my shoulder. "For the album." He smiled. A wide, perfect, camera-ready smile. I smiled back, leaning my head against his, and as I looked at him, I saw it. The smile was a perfect curve on his lips, but it went no further. His eyes, they were somewhere else. They were vacant. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was a kind of polished emptiness. He was performing for the camera, for the idea of us, for the story we were supposed to be telling. In that fraction of a second, the whole illusion shattered. The warm air turned cold against my skin. The sound of the gentle waves lapping at the shore seemed to mock me, and the voice inside me spoke its truth. This is a mistake. It was so sharp, so certain, that I physically flinched. He didn't notice. The picture was taken, he looked at it, nodded with satisfaction, and we kept walking. But for me, everything had changed. A hairline crack had just appeared in the foundation of my happily ever after. I spent the rest of the week, and the next 7 years, pretending I hadn't felt the tremor. I told myself it was nerves. I told myself it was post-wedding blues. I told myself that love wasn't a feeling, it was a choice, and I was choosing this. Every single day, I chose to ignore the voice. We came back from that trip and dove headfirst into the American dream. We bought a house in the suburbs with a yard that needed mowing and a porch that needed a swing. I became an expert at creating the illusion of a home. I spent months agonizing over paint swatches, finding the perfect shade of greige for the living room. I arranged throw pillows with architectural precision. I filled photo frames with pictures of us smiling, on vacation, at holiday parties, on that beach during that sunset. Our house looked like a magazine spread, a testament to a perfect life. But at night, when the lights were off, I would lie in bed and feel the hollowness of it all. It was a beautiful stage, but the play was a tragedy. I became the consummate hostess. Our dinner parties were legendary among our friends. I'd spend 2 days cooking, setting a table that could have graced the cover of a lifestyle blog. I'd float through the room, refilling wine glasses, laughing at jokes, making sure everyone felt welcome and comfortable. And in the middle of it all, surrounded by people, I would feel a loneliness, so profound it was like a physical ache. I was the smiling curator of a museum dedicated to a life I wasn't actually living. After the last guest would leave, I'd stand in the kitchen, amidst the dirty dishes and half-empty bottles of wine, and the silence would be a crushing weight. I was the loneliest person in the room, and the room was my own life. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, I began to shrink. It started with small things. I loved to paint, but my easel gathered dust in the attic because he'd complain that the smell of turpentine gave him a headache. I was part of a book club, but I drifted away because he'd make little comments about how he was home alone while I was out, gossiping with my friends. My opinions started to soften, to bend, to eventually merge with his. In conversations with friends, I'd find myself waiting to see what he thought before I spoke. I was a cheerleader for his career, his hobbies, his dreams. But my own were packed away in boxes, like old college sweaters I might, someday, have a use for again. I was becoming his shadow, a pale imitation of the vibrant woman I used to be. The hairline crack I'd felt on the honeymoon wasn't a crack anymore. It was a chasm, and I was living on the edge of it, meticulously arranging flowers on the precipice, pretending the drop wasn't there. The 1,000 little cuts weren't dramatic. They were quiet, daily erosions, a dismissive wave of his hand when I talked about a success at work, an inside joke at my expense in front of friends, the way he'd plan our weekends without ever asking what I wanted to do. Each one was a tiny message. You are less important, your feelings don't matter. Your life is secondary to mine. And I absorbed them all, because believing them was less painful than facing the truth I'd known since that sunset on the beach. The end, when it came, was not a slow burn. It was an explosion. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was looking for an insurance document in his desk. My hand brushed against his laptop, and the screen woke up. An email was open. The words on the screen didn't make sense at first. They were just letters, jumbled and meaningless. And then, they snapped into focus. Words of love, of intimacy, of a shared life that wasn't ours. My world didn't just stop. It evaporated. The only sound was the frantic, panicked thumping of my own heart. I remember sinking to the floor, my hands still on the desk. There was no screaming, no crying, just a vast, empty silence. But in that silence, something else rose up. It was a strange and terrible kind of relief. This was it. This was the permission slip. For years, my gut had been screaming at me, but I had no proof. My marriage looked perfect from the outside. He wasn't a monster. He was just absent. And I was just unhappy. But unhappiness felt like a personal failing, not a valid reason to detonate a life. The affair, the betrayal, it wasn't the reason our marriage ended. It was just the undeniable, tangible evidence that the voice inside me had been right all along. It was the shock that finally forced me to look in the mirror. Later that night, I went into the bathroom and caught my reflection under the harsh vanity lights. I stared for a long, long time. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. Her eyes were hollow, haunted. There were lines of exhaustion around her mouth that I'd never seen before. Her shoulders were slumped in a permanent state of apology. She looked lost. She looked broken. And in that moment, my grief wasn't just for my marriage. It was for her. For the woman I had allowed to disappear. The question echoed in the silent bathroom. Who are you? And how did I let this happen to you? That was the moment the performance ended. The courage to leave wasn't born from a sudden surge of strength. It was born from sheer, soul-crushing burnout. I had nothing left to give, nothing left to pretend with. The only thing left to do was to save myself. The words, "I'm done," were the quietest, heaviest things I'd ever said. His reaction was a predictable storm of denial, anger, and then desperate bargaining. But for the first time, his emotions didn't move me. I was a ship that had already sunk, and he was standing on the shore, shouting at the ocean. The harder part was telling everyone else. Our families, our friends, they were all invested in the story of us. "But you're the perfect couple," they'd say, their confusion genuine. "Marriage is hard work. You can't just give up. Are you sure you're not just being emotional?" Each comment was a small paper cut on a gaping wound. I felt profoundly alone, standing in my truth while the rest of the world tried to convince me it was a lie. Then came the dismantling. The brutal, heart-wrenching logistics of separating two lives that had been intentionally woven together. We sat with a mediator and divided assets, our shared dreams reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. But the hardest part was the house. Going through room by room, deciding who would take the couch we bought together, the art we picked out on a trip, the dog we both loved. Every object was a landmine of memory. I packed my life into cardboard boxes, each one feeling heavier than the last. I held our wedding album in my hands, tracing the face of the smiling, hopeful girl on the cover. And I wept for her. I wasn't just leaving a man. I was leaving a version of myself I had tried so hard to be. The first night in my new apartment was the loudest silence I have ever heard. It was small, the walls were bare, and all I had was a mattress on the floor and a few boxes. The familiar sounds of his keys in the door, of the television in the other room, of his breathing next to me in bed, they were all gone, and the void they left was terrifying. I sat on the floor and felt a wave of fear, so intense it almost buckled me. What have I done? But then, underneath the fear, a tiny fragile flicker of something else sparked. Freedom. This silence. This emptiness. It was mine. It was a blank canvas. It was terrifying, yes. But for the first time in a very, very long time, it was also full of possibility. The rebuilding didn't happen overnight. It happened in small, quiet moments. It started with coffee. The first morning in my apartment, I made a pot of coffee just for me. I didn't have to worry if it was too strong for him, or if I'd made enough. I poured it into my favorite mug, sat by the window as the sun came up, and just drank it. Slowly. In silence. The simple act of enjoying a cup of coffee, entirely on my own terms, felt like a revolutionary act. A few weeks later, I was unpacking a box of old CDs. I found one from college, an album I used to love, one he had always called depressing. On an impulse, I put it on. A song came on that I used to dance to in my dorm room. And so, in the middle of my half-empty living room, surrounded by boxes, I started to dance. It was awkward at first, a clumsy shuffle. But then I closed my eyes and let the music take over. I danced with an abandon I hadn't felt in years. A pure, unself-conscious joy. I was moving my body for no one's pleasure but my own. It felt like coming home. I found the old easel in a box marked Misk. I bought a new set of paints. The smell of turpentine no longer gave me a headache. It smelled like reclaiming a lost part of myself. I started painting again, not with any goal in mind, but just for the feel of the brush on the canvas. I called an old friend from that book club, and we met for dinner. We talked for 3 hours, and I realized how much I had missed the simple act of a conversation where I could be completely, unfiltered myself. My little apartment, once a symbol of fear and loneliness, slowly transformed into a sanctuary. I filled it not with things that looked good, but with things that felt good. A lumpy, comfortable armchair, books stacked on every surface, my messy, vibrant paintings on the walls. I was learning to be the architect of my own happiness. I was learning to come home, only this time, the home was me. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see the woman who was staring back at me that night in the bathroom, but I also see so much more. The scars haven't vanished. They are a part of my landscape now, a roadmap that reminds me of where I've been. They are a testament to my survival. The woman telling this story is not a victim. She is a cartographer of her own heart, and she knows the way home. My divorce was not a failure. It was a graduation. It was the moment I finally earned a degree in myself. I had to learn the hardest lesson of all. That you can love someone with your whole heart, but that doesn't mean you should sacrifice your whole self. The end of that chapter wasn't the end of my story. It was the prologue. It was the moment my real story, the one I was always meant to write, could finally begin. The greatest love story we will ever live is the one we write with ourselves. And sometimes, you have to be willing to burn down the life you thought you wanted, to build a palace where you, and you alone, finally wear the crown. Before the sunset there was a beginning, there was a first glance. And it's strange, looking back, how the most monumental chapters of our lives often begin so quietly, without any fanfare at all. For me, it began with the clinking of champagne glasses, and a song I didn't particularly like playing a little too loudly. We met at a wedding, of course we did. It was the perfect setting for a storybook romance to begin. It was a crisp autumn evening at a winery upstate, the kind of place with exposed wooden beams, strings of fairy lights, and an air of expensive, rustic charm. I was there for my college roommate, the bride. He was there for the groom, his business school classmate. I remember standing by the bar, feeling a little adrift in a sea of couples, watching the dance floor with a detached sort of amusement. And then, I felt someone's presence beside me. I didn't even have to look. You know that feeling? When the energy in the space around you shifts. I turned, and there he was. He wasn't looking at me, not at first. He was ordering a drink, and I remember thinking he moved with a kind of effortless confidence, as if the world was a space designed for him to occupy. He was handsome in that classic, undeniable way. A sharp jaw, dark hair, a suit that fit him perfectly. But it wasn't that. It was the way he commanded attention without demanding it. He turned from the bar, drink in hand, and his eyes met mine. And he smiled. It wasn't the wide, camera-ready smile I would come to know later. This one was smaller, a little crooked, and it seemed to hold a question in it. "You're not a big fan of this song either, are you?" he said, his voice a low, steady hum beneath the music. I must have had a look on my face. I laughed, a real, surprised laugh. "Is it that obvious?" I asked. "Only to a fellow sufferer," he replied, and that was it. We were in. My first impression of him was that he was a port in a storm. He was calm, he was focused, and when he spoke to you, he made you feel like you were the only person in a room of 200. He asked questions, real questions, not the small talk at a wedding kind. He asked about the book I was reading, about a trip I'd mentioned taking, and he listened, truly listened, to the answers. What attracted me wasn't just the confidence, it was the stillness inside of it. In a world that felt chaotic and uncertain, he felt like a sure thing. He felt like an anchor. In those early days, he was everything you're told a good man should be. He was ambitious, but he framed it as building a future for us. He was decisive, which I interpreted as strength. He was protective, which I mistook for profound care. He remembered that I liked my coffee with oat milk and a dash of cinnamon. He'd send me articles he thought I'd find interesting. He called my mother on her birthday. He was a master of the grand gesture, but he was even better at the small ones, the ones that weave their way into your heart and convince you you found someone who truly sees you. He was building a case, brick by perfect brick, and I was the most willing jury in the world. There was one night, about 6 months in. It's the memory I would replay in my mind for years, the one I'd hold up as evidence when my own doubts started to surface. We had gone out for a fancy dinner, one of those places with white tablecloths and hushed voices. Afterwards, instead of going home, he just started driving. He didn't say where we were going. We ended up at a park, one that overlooked the city skyline from across the river. It was late, past midnight, and the city was a glittering tapestry of light spread out before us. We sat on a cold park bench, and for a long time, we didn't say anything. Then he turned to me, and in the dim glow of the distant city I saw a look on his face I'd never seen before. It was vulnerability. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, "my whole life, I've had a plan. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I knew what every step was supposed to look like." He paused, taking my hand. His was warm against the cold night air. "And then I met you, and now, you're the only part of the plan that matters. Everything else is just details." He looked out at the lights, at that vast, sprawling metropolis of a million other stories. "I look at all that," he said, "and it doesn't scare me. None of it does. Not as long as I get to come home to you." In that moment, on that bench, under that blanket of stars, I felt a certainty so deep it was cellular. I wasn't just a part of his life. He was telling me I was the center of it, the foundation. That night, I didn't just fall in love with a man. I fell in love with a future. A beautiful, solid, unshakable future that he had laid out at my feet like a gift. It was the most convincing promise I had ever heard, and I believed every single word. That night on the bench wasn't a question, it was a coronation. I had been chosen, and from that moment on, everything accelerated, as if he'd pressed a fast-forward button on our lives. The transition from dating to marriage wasn't a transition at all. It was a destination he had already programmed into the GPS. The proposal came 6 months later. It was, of course, perfect. It was a surprise trip to a city I'd always wanted to visit, a weekend orchestrated with military precision. There was a suite at a boutique hotel, reservations at a restaurant I'd only read about in magazines. He had thought of everything, and I was swept away in the current of his planning, feeling cherished, feeling seen. On the final night, he took me to a bridge overlooking a river, just as the city lights began to sparkle to life. He didn't just get down on one knee. He first gave a speech, a beautiful, eloquent summary of our love story, hitting all the emotional beats. As if he were closing an argument he knew he had already won. He spoke of the future, our future, with such unshakable certainty. He painted a picture of a life, the house, the children, the shared successes, the growing old together. He wasn't just asking me to be his wife, he was offering me a membership to a life I had been taught my whole life to want. And when he finally opened the little velvet box, the ring inside wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a contract. It was proof. How could I say no to a dream I didn't even realize I had until he presented it to me, fully formed and gift-wrapped? Our first few years of marriage were a flurry of forward motion. We were a team, a unit, an enterprise. Our shared dream was the plan. And the plan was clear. He would climb the corporate ladder, and I would build the perfect launch pad for him. We bought the house he'd described on that bridge, a colonial in a town with good schools and old-growth trees. Our weekends were a blur of Home Depot runs and antique store finds. We argued playfully over paint chips and kitchen backsplashes. We weren't just building a home. We were building a brand. The brand of us. We were the couple who had it all together. The ones who hosted Thanksgiving for both our families. Who sent out perfectly designed Christmas cards. Who always brought the best bottle of wine to a dinner party. And there were moments of such profound, breathtaking happiness, moments that felt so real. They became the pillars I would lean on for years, long after the foundation had crumbled. I remember one Saturday, about a year after we moved in, the living room was still a work in progress. We had decided to paint it ourselves, a deep, calming blue. We had the windows open, the spring air was blowing in, and an old record was playing. We were covered in paint, splatters on our clothes, in our hair. He dabbed a bit of blue on my nose, and I retaliated, swiping a streak across his cheek, and it just dissolved into laughter. The kind of deep, belly-aching laughter that makes you weak. We ended up on a drop cloth in the middle of the floor, leaning against each other, exhausted and happy. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and he turned to me, his eyes clear and present, the way they were when we first met. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, a slow smile spreading across his paint-smeared face. And in that quiet, sun-drenched moment, surrounded by the beautiful mess we were making together, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. This was it. This was real. This was the forever he had promised me. That memory became my North Star. When the chill of that honeymoon sunset would creep back into my thoughts, I would pull out that memory of the sun, the paint, and his smile. I would hold it up to the light and tell myself, see? It's here. The love is right here. You just have to work harder to find it again. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment the tide began to turn. There was no single storm, no dramatic shipwreck. It was more like the slow, almost imperceptible erosion of a shoreline. You don't notice the sand disappearing grain by grain. You just wake up one day and realize the sea is closer to your house than it has any right to be. The love I remembered from that sun-drenched, paint-splattered afternoon didn't vanish. It was just buried. It was buried under the weight of expectation, of unspoken rules, of 1,000 tiny compromises that all seemed to be made by me. The first major shift came with his promotion. The one we had both been working toward, the one that validated all his long hours and my supportive dinners. When he got it, it felt like Tone's week had won. But what I didn't understand then was that in his mind, the team dynamic had changed. He was now the star quarterback, and I was being permanently relegated to the role of head cheerleader. His world expanded overnight. New responsibilities, important lunches, business trips. My world, in turn, began to shrink, one shuttered window at a time. It started with what he called helpful feedback. He was a perfectionist, he'd say, and he just wanted us, our life, to be the best it could be. It sounded like love. It sounded like care. But it felt like a constant, low-grade critique. I'd cook a new recipe, and he'd taste it and say, "This is good. You know what would make it great? A little less salt next time." I'd buy a new dress, and he'd look at me and say, "That color is nice on you, but the cut isn't the most flattering. You should have gone for the A-line." I'd tell him about a success I had at work, and he'd listen, nodding, before offering a strategic analysis of how I could have handled it even better. Each comment was a tiny chisel, chipping away at my confidence. I started to second-guess everything. I'd stand in my closet for 20 minutes before a dinner party, trying to see myself through his eyes, trying to choose the outfit that would earn approval instead of feedback. I stopped trying new recipes. I stopped talking as much about work. It was easier to be quiet. It was safer to be what he expected. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't angry. He was just improving me, polishing me. And in the process, he was sanding away all my edges, all the interesting textures that made me who I was. Then came the isolation, disguised as devotion. "Why do you need a book club?" he'd ask, his arm around me as we sat on the couch. "You can read here with me. We have so little time together as it is." It sounded so romantic. So I let the book club go. "Another night out with your friends?" he'd sigh, not with anger but with a kind of wounded disappointment. I was just hoping we could have a quiet night at home. And so, my world became the four walls of our beautiful house. He never forbade me from seeing people. He just made me feel guilty for wanting to. He made my need for connection outside of him feel like a betrayal of what we had. He was building a fortress around us. And I was so convinced it was for my protection that I didn't realize I was becoming a prisoner. The public humiliations were the worst, because they were always dressed up as jokes. We were at a dinner party with a few other couples, his work colleagues. I was telling a story about a clumsy mistake I'd made earlier that week, something funny and self-deprecating. Everyone was laughing with me. And then he jumped in. "Oh, that's nothing," he said, putting his hand on my back in a gesture that looked supportive but felt like an anchor. "You should have seen her trying to parallel park the other day. I thought we were going to have to call in an engineer." He smiled, a big, charming smile, and the table laughed. But this time, it felt different. They weren't laughing with me anymore. They were laughing at me. I felt my face flush hot with shame. I tried to smile along, to be a good sport, but something inside me curled up and died. Later that night, when I told him it had hurt my feelings, he looked at me with genuine confusion. "Babe, it was a joke," he said, shaking his head like I was a child. "You're being way too sensitive." And there it was, the master stroke of his control. My feelings were not valid. My reactions were an overreaction. I was the one with the problem. I was too sensitive, too emotional, reading too much into things. He had an answer for everything, a rationalization that always left him blameless, and me questioning my own sanity. This is what emotional abuse is. It's not a fist. It's a whisper. It's a slow, quiet poison that makes you believe you are the one who is sick. And so, I lived in that state for years. A low-level hum of anxiety became the soundtrack to my life. I walked on eggshells on my own designer rugs. I learned to anticipate his moods, to measure my words, to shrink myself down to fit into the ever-narrowing space he allowed for me. The voice from the honeymoon was still there, but it was buried now, deep under layers of doubt and fear, and the desperate need to believe that the man I married, the man from the park bench, was still in there somewhere. I just had to be good enough, quiet enough, perfect enough to coax him back out. The end, when it came, was not a slow burn. It was an explosion. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and unremarkable. He was on a 2-day business trip. I was looking for an insurance document for the car, and I remembered he'd said it was in his desk in our home office. It was a space I rarely entered, his sanctuary of polished wood and leather. I opened the top drawer and rummaged through a folder of papers. Nothing. I tried the second drawer. As I pulled it open, my hand brushed against his laptop, which was sitting closed on the desk. The screen flickered to life. An email was open. He must have forgotten to close it before he left. My eyes scanned the first few lines without comprehension. It was like reading a foreign language. Words of affection. Inside jokes I didn't understand. Plans for a future I wasn't in. The recipient's name was one I recognized, a woman from his office. My world didn't just stop. It evaporated. The only sound in that dead quiet room was the frantic, panicked thumping of my own heart against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. I remember sinking to the floor, my hand still resting on the cool wood of the desk. My breath came in shallow, useless gasps. There was no screaming, no crying, just a vast, empty silence that rushed in to fill the space where my life used to be. But in that silence, something else rose up. It was a strange and terrible kind of relief. This was it. This was the permission slip. For years my gut had been screaming at me, but I had no proof. My marriage looked perfect from the outside. He wasn't a monster. He was just absent. And I was just unhappy. But unhappiness felt like a personal failing, not a valid reason to detonate a life. The affair, the betrayal, it wasn't the reason our marriage ended. It was just the undeniable, tangible evidence that the voice inside me, the one I'd heard on that white sand beach under a perfect sunset, had been right all along. It was the shock that finally, forced me to look in the mirror. Later that night, I went into the master bathroom, the one with the marble countertops we'd picked out together, and caught my reflection under the harsh vanity lights. I stared for a long time. I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. Her eyes were hollow, haunted. There were lines of exhaustion etched around her mouth that I'd never seen before. Her shoulders were slumped in a permanent state of apology. She looked lost. She looked broken. And in that moment, my grief wasn't just for my marriage. It was for her, for the woman I had allowed to disappear. The question echoed in the silent bathroom. Who are you? And how did I let this happen to you? That was the moment the performance ended. The courage to leave wasn't born from a sudden surge of strength. It was born from sheer, soul-crushing burnout. I had nothing left to give. Nothing left to pretend with. The only thing left to do was to save myself. He came home the next evening, walking into a house that was different in a way he couldn't immediately place. The air itself felt changed, thinner, charged with an unspoken truth. I didn't greet him at the door with a kiss and a question about his trip. I was sitting on the living room couch, the one we'd spent a month choosing, and I didn't get up when he came in. He stopped in the entryway, dropping his briefcase. I watched him take in the scene. Me, fully dressed, sitting perfectly still in the near darkness, the house silent around us. Everything okay? He asked, his voice laced with a cautious sort of confusion. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in a long time, without the filter of hope or denial. I saw the man from the wedding, the man from the park bench, and the man from the email, all superimposed on one another. They were all the same person. I had just refused to see it. No, I said. My voice was calm, steady. It didn't even sound like my own. It's not. The conversation that followed wasn't the screaming match I had played out in my head 1,000 times over the years. There were no accusations hurled, no plates thrown. It was colder, quieter, and far more devastating than that. He sat in the armchair opposite me, creating a chasm of grage carpet between us. He started with his usual script: denial, confusion, concern for my emotional state. What's going on? You're scaring me, he said, leaning forward, trying to create a connection I was no longer willing to accept. I know about the emails, I said, and the words just hung there in the air. I watched the performance drain from his face, replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back. He tried to explain it away, to minimize it, to reframe it as a misunderstanding, a moment of weakness that meant nothing. But I wasn't listening to the words anymore. I was listening to the silence underneath them. The silence I had lived in for 7 years. I let him talk until he ran out of steam, until his excuses withered in the face of my stillness. When he was finally quiet, I took a breath. It doesn't matter, I said. The affair isn't the point, it's just the period at the end of a very long sentence. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. This was not in his playbook. He was losing control of the narrative. I want a divorce, I said. There it was. The word. It felt both foreign and inevitable on my tongue. He flinched as if I'd slapped him, and then the storm broke. The anger, the accusations that I was throwing away everything we had built. The desperate bargaining, the promises to change, to be better, to go to therapy. He even cried. But for the first time, his emotions had no power over me. I felt a profound, sorrowful detachment, like watching a movie where I already knew the ending. I wasn't a participant anymore. I was just an observer of the final scene. The days that followed were a blur of brutal logistics. He moved into the guest room, and we lived like ghosts in the house we had built, communicating through terse text messages about mail and bills. The hardest part was telling people. My parents' reaction was a cocktail of disappointment and concern. "Marriage is work," my mother said, her voice strained over the phone. "You made a commitment." His parents were less diplomatic. "I was selfish. I was ungrateful. I was destroying their son's life." Our friends were the most confusing. They were invested in the brand of us, the perfect couple. "But you guys never fight," one of them said, as if the absence of screaming meant the presence of happiness. "Are you sure you're not just going through a phase?" Each conversation felt like I was on trial, forced to defend a decision that was already ripping my own heart out. I learned quickly to stop explaining. I was standing in my truth, and it was the loneliest place I had ever been. The process of the divorce itself was a cold, methodical dismemberment of our life. We chose mediation to avoid a courtroom battle. We sat across a polished mahogany table from each other, a neutral third party asking us to divide our shared history into two neat columns. His and hers. The house, the car, the investments, it was all just numbers on a page. But then we got to the personal items. I remember one moment with searing clarity. We were discussing the art on the walls. There was a painting we had bought on our first anniversary trip, a beautiful, abstract landscape of blues and grays. We had both loved it instantly. "I'd like to keep the painting," I said, my voice quiet. "No," he said, his jaw tight. "I want it. We bought it together." "I know we did," I said, looking at him, trying to appeal to the man I thought I knew. "But it was my favorite." "It was mine, too," he countered, his voice hard. We sat there, in that sterile office, arguing over a canvas of paint and memories. And I realized he wasn't fighting for the painting, he was fighting to win. He was fighting for one last piece of me. In that moment, I let it go. "Fine," I said, feeling something inside me break. "You can have it." I would not fight for the symbols of a life that was already gone. I needed to save my strength for building a new one. The final day came 6 months later. We met at his lawyer's office to sign the last of the papers. It was a Tuesday, just like the day my world had evaporated. I walked into the conference room, and he was already there, staring out the window. He looked tired. He looked like a stranger. We didn't speak. The lawyer slid the thick stack of papers across the table. "Sign on the indicated lines, please." My hand was shaking as I picked up the heavy pen. I looked down at the page, at the black and white text that officially dissolved the story of us. I thought of the girl on the honeymoon, the girl painting a living room, the girl who believed in forever. A single, hot tear escaped and fell onto the page, smudging the ink of a word I couldn't read. I took a deep breath, wiped my eyes, and signed my name. A name that was, for the last time, his. As I wrote the final letter, a feeling washed over me that I didn't expect. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't even pure relief. It was a profound, earth-shattering sense of quiet. The noise in my head, the constant hum of anxiety, of trying, of failing, of pretending, it just stopped. I pushed the papers back across the table. I stood up. I didn't look at him. I walked out of that office, out of that building, and into the afternoon sun, and for the first time in a decade, I felt the warmth on my skin. I had walked in as one half of a broken whole, but I was walking out as myself, complete, terrified, and finally, breathtakingly, free. The first few months after the divorce were not a celebration. They were a reckoning. The silence I had craved for so long was suddenly a physical presence in my tiny apartment. It was a howling, cavernous void, and in the beginning, I was terrified of it. I had spent a decade tailoring my entire existence around another person's schedule, his moods, his needs, and now, in the quiet, I had no one to orbit but myself. I didn't know how. There were nights I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom feeling of his weight on the other side of the bed so real, I'd reach for it. There were Sundays so achingly long and empty that I thought the loneliness would swallow me whole. Grief is a strange beast. I wasn't just mourning the end of a marriage. I was mourning the woman who had entered it, full of hope. I was mourning the future I had so carefully designed, a future that had turned out to be a blueprint for a house I was never meant to live in. But in that vast, terrifying emptiness, tiny seeds of something else began to sprout. It started with the smallest rebellions. I bought a duvet cover that was a loud, obnoxious floral pattern he would have hated. I left my shoes by the front door. I ate cereal for dinner, standing over the kitchen sink, simply because I could. Each tiny act was a declaration of independence. This space, this life, this mess, it was mine. I started therapy. I walked into a stranger's quiet office, sat on a comfortable couch, and, for the first time, I told the whole story, from the sunset to the signature. I said the words out loud that I had buried for years. He made me feel small. I was so lonely. I think I stopped being me. And the therapist didn't tell me I was being too sensitive. She just nodded, and in her eyes, I saw, not pity, but recognition. She gave me the language for what I had experienced, and more importantly, the permission to be angry about it, to be sad about it, and finally, to start healing from it. I called my old friends, the ones I had drifted from. I was so afraid of their judgment, but all I found was grace. We'd sit for hours over coffee or wine, and I would just listen to their lives, realizing how much I had missed by being trapped in my own little two-person universe. I picked up my paintbrush again. The first things I painted were angry slashes of black and red. Then came murky, confused blues and grays. And then, one day, a surprising sliver of yellow appeared on the canvas. And then more. I wasn't painting for anyone's approval. I was painting my way back to myself. My life today is unrecognizable from what it was. I live in that same small apartment, but it is no longer empty. It is full. It's filled with my paintings, which now cover the walls. It's filled with stacks of books that spill from every surface. It's filled with the smell of coffee in the morning, and the sound of music I love playing too loud. It is a sanctuary I built with my own two hands, for my own heart. My routine is simple, but it's sacred. I wake with the sun, I take my time. I learned that I am not a machine of efficiency. I am a person who needs quiet moments. I've become fiercely protective of my peace. The woman I am now is different. She is slower to speak, but quicker to trust her own intuition. She no longer seeks validation from the outside, because she is learning to generate it from within. She has boundaries, not as walls to keep people out, but as fences to protect the garden she has worked so hard to grow. I've learned that true love doesn't diminish you. It doesn't ask you to shrink or to quiet your voice. Real love, the kind worth having, holds up a mirror and says, "Look how magnificent you are. Be more of that." I learned that the opposite of love isn't hate. It's indifference. And I had been living in a state of profound indifference to my own soul for far too long. Have I forgiven him? That's a complicated question. I don't think about him much anymore. The anger has faded. Not into acceptance of what he did, but into an understanding that his actions were about his own emptiness, not my worth. Forgiveness for me wasn't about him at all. It was about me. It was about finally putting down the heavy bag of rocks I had been carrying, so I could walk forward with my hands free. I have forgiven myself, though. I've forgiven myself for not knowing sooner, for not being stronger, for believing that love meant disappearing. I was doing the best I could with what I knew at the time. And that young woman deserves compassion more than anyone. As for the future, I don't have a 5-year plan anymore. I have a today plan. Today, I will do work that I find meaningful. Today, I will move my body in a way that feels good. Today, I will connect with someone I love. Am I open to a new relationship? Yes. But my life is not a waiting room for a partner to arrive. My life is the main event. If someone comes along who wants to add to this beautiful, messy, vibrant existence I've created, the door is open. But I will never again hand anyone the key to the entire house. The greatest lesson from all of this is that I am already whole. The love I was so desperately seeking from someone else was inside me all along. I just had to get quiet enough to hear it. I had to come home. If I could go back and speak to that woman on the beach, the one with the brand new ring on her finger, and the terrifying chill in her heart, what would I say? I wouldn't tell her to run. She wasn't ready to hear that. Her heart was too full of hope, too invested in the promise of a story she'd been told her whole life was the only one worth living. Instead, I would sit next to her in the sand, watch that impossible sunset with her, and I would whisper, "Listen. Just listen. That voice you just heard, the one that feels like a betrayal, the one you're already trying to bury under a mountain of excuses, That's not your fear talking. That is the truest, wisest, most sacred part of you. It's your soul's compass, and it is pointing north. It will not break, it will not lie, and it will never, ever leave you. I would tell her, you are not broken for feeling this. You are not ungrateful. You are not too sensitive. You are a woman who knows, on a cellular level, the difference between the performance of love and the feeling of it. And that knowing is not a curse. It is your greatest gift. I would tell her that the journey ahead will be harder than she can imagine, but not for the reasons she thinks. The hardest part won't be the leaving. It will be all the years she spends trying to stay, all the energy she will pour into pretending that hairline crack is just a shadow. And then I would tell her, with all the certainty of a survivor, one day you will be so tired you can't take another step. And in that exhaustion, you will find your courage, you will choose yourself, and it will be the hardest and most beautiful decision of your life. And on the other side of all that fear, all that pain, is a woman you haven't even met yet, and she is magnificent. She is waiting for you. And if you are listening to this right now, and my story sounds a little too much like your own, if you are living in a beautiful house that feels like a stage, if you are smiling for pictures while a silent scream builds in your chest, please hear me. You are not alone. And you are not crazy. That feeling in your gut is not an overreaction. It is your truth. The 1,000 little cuts, the dismissive comments disguised as jokes, the slow, quiet erosion of who you are, that is real. Your loneliness in a crowded room is real. Your exhaustion from walking on eggshells in your own home is real. Do not let anyone, not even yourself, convince you that your feelings are not a valid reason to change your life. Your peace is worth more than their comfort. Your soul is worth more than their approval. The journey back to yourself will not happen overnight. It will happen in small, quiet acts of rebellion. It might start with buying the book he'd find silly. It might be taking a walk, alone, without telling anyone where you're going. It might be saying a quiet no to something that drains your spirit. These are not small things. They are everything. They are you, remembering yourself. Please know this. Leaving a life that is dimming your light is not a failure, it is a graduation. It is the most profound act of faith. Faith in a future you cannot yet see. Faith in a strength you do not yet know you possess. The end of a story you thought was your forever is not the end of your story. It is the moment you finally pick up the pen and begin to write your own. The real one. The one where you are not just a character, but the author, the hero, the love of your own life. And your palace is waiting. You need only be brave enough to build it.